The crystalline walls of the Galactic Council's grand chamber stretched impossibly high, their surfaces pulsing with the soft blue glow of contained energy fields. 12,000 years of galactic civilization had built this monument to diplomatic order, where conflicts were resolved through careful negotiation and measured compromise. The chamber could hold representatives from 800 different species, each breathing apparatus carefully calibrated, each environmental need precisely met. Today, however, the vast space felt suffocatingly small. High Chancellor Vorthak of the Zolonian hegemony stood at the central podium, his 6 arms gesticulating in the complex patterns that denoted extreme agitation among his kind. The Chancellor's blue-scaled hide, normally a calming azure, had darkened to an ominous indigo that made the assembled representatives shift nervously in their specialized seating arrangements. The source of the Chancellor's distress sat in the human delegation area, a modest cluster of chairs that seemed almost laughably simple compared to the elaborate life support systems surrounding them. 5 humans occupied those chairs, their faces masks of polite attention that somehow managed to radiate complete indifference to the proceedings. Ambassador Elena Vasquez, the lead human representative, sat perfectly still, her dark eyes fixed on the Chancellor with the kind of patient focus that predators reserve for prey. Beside her, General Marcus Chen's scarred hands rested calmly on his knees, while Dr. Sarah Kim, Admiral James Morrison, and Director Alex Petrov maintained the same unsettling composure. "The terms are non-negotiable," Chancellor Vorthak declared, his voice amplified by the chamber's acoustic systems to reach every corner of the vast space. "The human species will immediately cease all expansion beyond the Sol system. They will submit to Council oversight for all technological development. They will provide detailed records of all military capabilities and surrender 70% of their current fleet for decommissioning." A murmur rippled through the assembled delegates. The Thari representatives, resembling enormous praying mantises, clicked their mandibles in what served as their equivalent of nervous laughter. The floating jellyfish-like aquarians pulsed with colors that indicated deep concern. Even the usually stoic rock beings from Petra Prime shifted with movements that sent small tremors through the chamber floor. The Chancellor continued, his voice growing more strident with each word. "Furthermore, humanity will accept the permanent installation of Council peacekeeping forces in all major population centers and will limit their birth rate according to approved galactic population protocols." The demands had been building for months. What had started as gentle suggestions from the Council's diplomatic corps had escalated through increasingly stern warnings, economic sanctions, and finally threats of military intervention. The problem, from the Council's perspective, was simple. Humans were expanding too fast, developing too quickly, and showing an alarming tendency toward independence that threatened the carefully balanced order of galactic civilization. Ambassador Vasquez stood slowly, her movement drawing the attention of every being in the chamber. She was not particularly tall by human standards, but something in her bearing made her seem to tower over the assembled representatives. When she spoke, her voice was clear and carried easily without amplification. "No." The word hung in the air like a physical presence. Chancellor Vorthak's 6 arms froze mid-gesture. The chamber fell silent, except for the soft hum of life support systems and the distant thrum of the station's massive engines. "I beg your pardon," the Chancellor said, his translation device struggling to process what it had heard. "No," Vasquez repeated, her tone conversational. "We decline your terms." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Delegates leaped to their feet, tentacles waved frantically, and a cacophony of outraged voices filled the chamber. The Zolonian Chancellor's hide shifted through several shades of purple before settling on a dangerous crimson. "You cannot simply refuse," he sputtered. "These are the considered demands of the Galactic Council, representing the will of 637 member species. This is how civilization works. We negotiate, we compromise. We find common ground. And we appreciate the effort you've put into these demands," Admiral Morrison interjected, his weathered face showing nothing but polite interest. "They're very thorough, quite detailed. Clearly a lot of thought went into them." "Then you accept?" Hope crept into the Chancellor's voice. "Of course not," Morrison replied. "They're completely unacceptable." "Doctor." Kim leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on the patient tone of a teacher addressing slow students.
"Perhaps there's been some confusion about how this works."
"You see, when someone makes demands of you, you have several options. You can accept them, you can counter with alternative proposals, or you can reject them entirely. We're choosing option 3. The chamber erupted again. Representatives from the hegemony were making aggressive clicking sounds while the Aquarian delegates had begun flashing warning colors so rapidly that several other species were showing signs of distress. The rock beings from Petra Prime were grinding against their seats in what could only be described as geological profanity. Chancellor Vorthak raised all 6 arms for silence, and when order was finally restored, his voice carried a note of barely contained fury. You are one species, one small, primitive species that has barely crawled out of its home system. We are the Galactic Council. We represent the combined will and might of hundreds of advanced civilizations. You cannot simply say no to us. Director Petrov, who had remained silent until now, chose this moment to speak. His voice was soft, almost gentle, but it carried clearly through the chamber's acoustics. Actually, we can, and we just did. This is madness, declared Councillor Efmara of the Tari Collective, her mandibles clacking rapidly. Every species that has achieved interstellar capability has joined the Council. It is the natural order. It is how peace is maintained. General Chen finally spoke, his gravelly voice cutting through the diplomatic chatter like a blade. Your peace is built on submission. Our peace is built on strength. The chamber fell silent again, but this time the silence had a different quality. It was the silence of predators suddenly realizing they might be facing something unexpected. Ambassador Vasquez stepped forward to address the full assembly. Honored representatives, we understand your system. We've studied your history, your methods, your countless successful negotiations and peaceful resolutions. It's impressive, truly. You've built something remarkable here. Murmurs of agreement rippled through some sections of the chamber. But you seem to have misunderstood something fundamental about humanity, Vasquez continued. We didn't come here to join your system. We came here to inform you that we exist, and that we'll be conducting our affairs according to our own judgment. What you choose to do with that information is entirely up to you. Chancellor Vorthak's hide was now cycling rapidly through multiple colors, a sign of extreme distress among his species. You speak of conducting your affairs, but your affairs affect the rest of us. Your expansion disrupts established trade routes. Your technology develops without oversight. Your military grows without constraint. You are upsetting the balance that has maintained peace for 12 millennia. Your peace, Dr. Kim corrected softly. Your balance, built on your terms, for your benefit. For everyone's benefit, the Chancellor protested. The Council system has ended war, eliminated poverty, brought order to chaos. Admiral Morrison stood slowly, his movement deliberate and careful. Tell me, Chancellor, how many species have chosen not to join your council? None, Vorthak replied immediately. Because the benefits are obvious to any rational civilization. Or because the consequences of refusal are too severe to contemplate, Morrison suggested. The chamber erupted once more, but this time the outrage was mixed with something else. Several representatives were exchanging glances, their body language suggesting discomfort with the direction of the conversation. You are accusing us of coercion, Councillor Zephyran of the Ethereal Collective declared, his energy-based form flickering with agitation. We are peacekeepers, not conquerors. We're not accusing you of anything, Director Petrov replied calmly. We're simply declining to participate in your system. Which brings us to the heart of the matter, Ambassador Vasquez said, returning to the center of the discussion. You've offered us membership in your organization, with its accompanying benefits and responsibilities. We've politely declined. In any reasonable system, that would be the end of it. But this is not any system, Chancellor Vorthak declared, his voice rising. This is the Galactic Council. No one declines membership in the Galactic Council. We just did. The simple statement hung in the air like a challenge. Around the chamber, representatives were beginning to whisper among themselves, their various forms of communication creating a low susurrus of uncertainty. You cannot exist outside the system, Councillor Efmara insisted. It is impossible, impractical, dangerous. To whom? General Chen asked quietly. The question seemed to catch the councillor off guard. To everyone, to galactic stability, to the peace we have worked so hard to maintain, or to the power structure that peace depends upon. Doctor, Kim suggested. The whispers in the chamber grew louder, and Chancellor Vorthak raised his arms for order once more. When silence returned, his voice carried a note of desperation that had not been there before. What is it you want? Resources? Territory? Technology? These things can be negotiated. Compromises can be reached. But you must work within the system. Ambassador Vasquez smiled for the first time since entering the chamber, and somehow That smile was more unsettling than any of the threats that had been made. What we want, Chancellor, is to be left alone to make our own choices, to succeed or fail on our own terms, and to face the consequences of our own decisions. What we want is freedom. Freedom is chaos, the Chancellor replied automatically, reciting what was clearly a fundamental tenet of Council philosophy. Maybe, Vasquez agreed. But it's our chaos. The chamber had grown eerily quiet, as if the assembled representatives were finally beginning to grasp the magnitude of what was happening. This wasn't a negotiation that had gotten out of hand. This wasn't a diplomatic crisis that could be resolved with the right combination of incentives and pressure. This was something entirely new in their experience, a complete rejection of the fundamental assumptions upon which their civilization was built. You understand, Chancellor Vorthak said slowly, his voice heavy with implications, that if you refuse to join the Council voluntarily, other measures may become necessary. We understand perfectly, Admiral Morrison replied, his tone conversational despite the threat implicit in the Chancellor's words. The question is whether you understand what those other measures would actually entail. The Admiral's words carried a weight that seemed to press down on the entire chamber. Representatives who had been growing increasingly agitated suddenly became very still, as if they were beginning to realize that they might be dealing with something more dangerous than simple diplomatic intransigence. In the silence that followed, the 5 human representatives sat quietly, their expressions calm and patient. They looked, for all the world, like people waiting for a bus, rather than representatives of a species facing the combined pressure of the galaxy's most powerful alliance. And in that calm patience, something new was born in the chamber. For the first time in 12,000 years of galactic civilization, the representatives of the Galactic Council began to experience something their ancestors had almost forgotten: uncertainty about the outcome of their demands. The age of automatic compliance was ending, though none of them yet realized it. The humans had said no, and somehow, that simple word was beginning to change everything. 3 hours after the formal session had ended in chaos, emergency meetings were convening across the station. In the Zolonian diplomatic quarters, Chancellor Vorthak stood before a holographic display showing the tactical positions of every council fleet in the galaxy. The blue light from the projections cast strange shadows across his darkened hide as he gestured at the assembled military commanders. "Explain to me," he said, his voice tight with controlled frustration, "how 5 individuals from a species that achieved faster-than-light travel less than 50 years ago can sit in that chamber and dictate terms to us." Fleet Admiral Kestar, of the Hegemony Navy, a grizzled veteran whose scales bore the ritual scars of a dozen major campaigns, studied the display with professional interest. "They're not dictating terms, Chancellor. They're refusing to acknowledge our authority. There's a significant difference. A difference that changes what? Exactly. Everything," Admiral Kestar replied grimly. "If they were trying to negotiate better terms, we'd have leverage points, pressure we could apply, concessions we could make. But they're not engaging with the system at all. They're operating outside it entirely." The Chancellor's aide, a nervous young Zolonian named Trexlin, ventured a question. "But surely they can't maintain that position indefinitely. The economic pressure alone should force them to reconsider." Admiral Kestar turned away from the display to face the aide directly.
What economic pressure?
"They're not asking us to trade with them. They're not requesting access to our shipping lanes or our markets. According to our intelligence, they're completely self-sufficient within their own system and the colonies they've established." "Then we cut them off completely," Chancellor Vorthak declared. "Total embargo. No council member trades with them, no ships enter their space, nothing gets in or out." "Sir," Admiral Kestar said carefully, "they're already operating under a de facto embargo. They haven't requested access to any council facilities or services. In fact, according to our monitoring stations, they seem to be actively avoiding contact with our trade routes." The Chancellor's hide shifted to a deeper purple. "Then what are they doing out there?" "Expanding," the Admiral replied simply, "at a rate that frankly concerns our strategic planning division. In the past year alone, they've established permanent colonies on 17 worlds, built 3 major shipyards, and begun construction of what our analysts believe are deep space manufacturing facilities. Without council oversight," Chancellor Vorthak muttered. "Without regulation, without safety protocols, without any regard for the environmental impact assessments." "And apparently," Admiral Kestar continued, "without any need for our approval or assistance." Meanwhile, in a secure chamber deep within the Council's intelligence complex, Director Yulmoth of the Information Assessment Division was briefing a select group of senior officials on what their surveillance networks had revealed about human capabilities. Director Yulmoth was a member of the Contemplative Order, a species that had evolved from social insects and retained their ancestors' talent for processing vast amounts of information simultaneously. His compound eyes could track dozens of data streams while his mandibles clicked through the complex calculations that served his kind as thought. The initial assessment was that humanity represented a standard emerging civilization, he reported to the assembled group. Rapid technological development, aggressive expansion patterns, typical post-scarcity growing pains. Nothing we hadn't seen hundreds of times before. But the current assessment is different, prompted Councillor Zarathil of the Mediation Council, her crystalline form refracting the chamber's light into prismatic rainbows. Significantly different, Director Yulmoth confirmed. Our assumptions were based on incomplete data. We were monitoring their communications, their trade patterns, their diplomatic overtures. What we weren't monitoring was what they weren't doing. The statement hung in the air like a riddle. Councillor Athmara leaned forward, her mantis-like form casting angular shadows. Explain. Most emerging civilizations follow predictable patterns, the director continued. They develop faster than light travel, make contact with galactic civilization, go through a period of cultural shock, then begin the integration process. They need our infrastructure, our trade networks, our technological databases. They have gaps in their knowledge that require filling, resource needs that require meeting, social problems that require solving. And humans are different how? They don't seem to need any of that, Director Yulmoth replied. Our intelligence suggests they've developed solutions to problems they haven't even encountered yet. They've built redundant systems for technologies they don't currently use. They've established research facilities focused on scenarios that our own strategic planners haven't considered. Councillor Zarathil's crystalline structure rang with a sound like distant bells, her species' equivalent of nervous laughter. You're saying they're preparing for threats that don't exist? I'm saying they're preparing for threats that don't exist yet, the director corrected, and some that we've never even imagined. The briefing continued for another hour, revealing a picture of human civilization that grew more unsettling with each detail. The humans had not simply rejected council membership, they had apparently built their entire expansion strategy around the assumption that such membership would never be an option. Back in the human delegation quarters, a very different conversation was taking place. The 5 human representatives sat around a simple table, sharing a meal of food brought from Earth. The contrast between their modest accommodations and the elaborate environmental systems elsewhere on the station was stark. They're taking longer than we expected to reach the obvious conclusion, General Chen observed, cutting into what appeared to be a perfectly ordinary steak. The obvious conclusion being? Doctor, Kim asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. That they're going to have to use force, Admiral Morrison replied. The question is whether they'll admit it to themselves before or after they try economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, and all the other tools that don't work when the target isn't playing by your rules. Ambassador Vasquez set down her fork and looked thoughtfully at the chamber's viewport, which showed the vast expanse of space beyond the station. How long do we give them to figure it out? Director Chen estimates 6 to 8 hours before they start floating the idea of military intervention, Director Petrov said, consulting a tablet. Psychological modeling suggests they'll need to exhaust all perceived alternatives first, and they'll start with a show of force, General Chen added. Probably move a fleet to the edge of our space, make it clear they could enter if they chose to. Will they? Dr. Kim asked. Admiral Morrison's expression grew thoughtful. That depends on what they learn when they do their threat assessment. Right now, they're operating on assumptions based on standard emergence patterns. When those assumptions prove incorrect, he didn't need to finish the thought. They all understood the implications. The conversation was interrupted by a soft chime from the communication system. Ambassador Vasquez activated the display, revealing the concerned features of Captain Sarah Torres aboard the human vessel Defiance, currently stationed at the edge of the Sol system. Ambassador, Captain Torres reported, long-range sensors are detecting significant fleet movements throughout Council space. It looks like they're repositioning assets for potential operations. How significant? Admiral Morrison asked, moving into the display's pickup range. 3 full battle groups have departed their home bases in the last 2 hours. Current trajectory suggests they're planning to converge at the edge of our territorial claims. Ambassador Vasquez nodded calmly. Expected timeline for arrival? Approximately 18 hours at their current speed. Thank you, Captain. Continue monitoring and keep us informed. The transmission ended, leaving the 5 representatives in thoughtful silence. 18 hours, Dr. Warwick, Kim mused. Faster than Director Chen estimated. They're more rattled than we expected, General Chen agreed. Good. Rattled people make predictable mistakes. The question, Director Petrov said quietly, is whether we want them to make mistakes or learn from them. Ambassador Vasquez turned back to the viewport. In the distance, barely visible even to the station's enhanced sensors, lay the edge of human space. Out there, beyond the reach of Council authority, human civilization continued its relentless expansion according to its own vision of what the future should look like. We want them to understand, she said finally. Understanding is the foundation of respect, and respect is the foundation of the kind of relationship that might actually work long-term. And if they choose not to understand? Admiral Morrison asked. Vasquez's reflection in the viewport showed a smile that held no humor. Then they'll learn instead, one way or the other. Back in the Council's Emergency Command Center, Chancellor Vorthak was receiving reports from across the galaxy. The human refusal had sent shockwaves through the diplomatic community, and junior members of the Council were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about what would happen if other species followed humanity's example. The Rigel Alliance is requesting clarification on the mandatory nature of Council membership, reported Age Trexlan, his voice tight with nervousness. Apparently, their governing council is asking whether membership is truly voluntary if refusal isn't permitted. And the Outer Rim Confederacy? They've requested a formal review of the membership charter, specifically the sections dealing with species sovereignty and self-determination.
Chancellor Vorthak's hide darkened further.
How many others? 17 species have submitted formal inquiries in the past 3 hours, all requesting clarification on various aspects of membership obligations. The Chancellor turned to Admiral Kestar, who had been monitoring the military situation. Your assessment? Honestly, we're facing something unprecedented. If this develops into a broader challenge to Council authority, we could be looking at the collapse of the entire system. Because one primitive species said no, Admiral Kestar's expression was grim. Because one species said no and made it stick. That changes everything, Chancellor. If membership isn't mandatory, then it has to be voluntary. And if it has to be voluntary, then it has to be beneficial. And if it has to be beneficial, then we have to actually provide benefits rather than simply demanding compliance. The Chancellor finished, his voice hollow. The 2 senior officials stood in silence, contemplating the implications of a galaxy where the Galactic Council's authority rested on consent rather than inevitability. In the depths of the station, automated systems continued their work, maintaining life support, processing information, facilitating the countless small operations that kept galactic civilization functioning. The systems didn't care about the crisis unfolding in the political chambers above. They simply continued their programmed tasks, reliable and efficient, and utterly indifferent to the fact that the foundations of their creator's power were beginning to shift. Outside the station, space continued its ancient dance of stars and planets and cosmic forces that dwarfed the concerns of any individual species. The universe itself remained unchanged by the events in the Council chamber. But within the small sphere of space where sentient life had learned to build cities and fleets and governments, something fundamental was changing. Humanity had said no. And in that refusal, they had introduced a new variable into an equation that had been stable for 12,000 years. The galaxy would never be quite the same again, though it would take time for all the implications to become clear. For now, fleets were moving, diplomats were arguing, and 5 humans sat calmly around a simple table, eating food from home and waiting to see what the rest of the galaxy would decide to do about them. The waiting, they knew, wouldn't last much longer. The Council fleet that emerged from hyperspace at the edge of human territory was an impressive sight. 3 battle groups comprising over 200 vessels arranged themselves in a formation that had been perfected through centuries of successful intimidation. The massive dreadnoughts hung in space like metallic mountains, their hulls bristling with weapons that could crack planets. Surrounding them, cruisers and destroyers moved in precise patterns that spoke of military discipline and overwhelming force. Fleet Admiral Kestar stood on the bridge of the flagship Inevitable Victory, watching the tactical displays that showed the human response to their arrival. Or rather, the complete lack of human response. "Sir," reported his tactical officer, "we're detecting no change in human fleet movements. No mobilization, no defensive positioning, nothing." "They're ignoring us," Admiral Kestar muttered, though whether he sounded relieved or concerned was difficult to determine. Perhaps they don't understand the implications of our presence, suggested Captain Morthek, his aide-de-camp. The Admiral turned to study the long-range sensors. Beyond the fleet's position, human space stretched out in a rough sphere, encompassing dozens of star systems. The intelligence reports suggested a thriving civilization with hundreds of colonies, massive industrial capacity, and a military that remained frustratingly opaque to Council analysis. They understand perfectly, he said finally. The question is what they intend to do about it. The answer came 6 hours later, not from human military forces but from a single small ship that appeared on their sensors approaching at a leisurely pace. The vessel was clearly human in design, sleek and functional, without the ornate details that marked most Council starships. It was also, according to their readings, completely unarmed. "Sir," the communications officer announced, "we're receiving a transmission from the approaching vessel." On screen, the main display shimmered and resolved into the image of a middle-aged human woman wearing what appeared to be a simple blue uniform. Her expression was politely curious, as if she had encountered something mildly interesting during an afternoon stroll. "Good afternoon," she said pleasantly. "I'm Captain Helen Rodriguez of the Earth vessel Curiosity. I understand you're here to make some kind of demonstration regarding human space?" Admiral Kestar found himself momentarily speechless. In all his years of military service, he had never encountered such casual indifference to overwhelming force. "I am Fleet Admiral Kestar of the Galactic Council Navy," he managed finally. "You are in violation of Council space protocols." "Actually," Captain Rodriguez replied conversationally, "you're currently in what we consider human space, but we're not particularly territorial about these things. You're welcome to be here as long as you maintain peaceful intentions."
Peaceful intentions? The Admiral's voice rose slightly.
"This is a military fleet capable of sterilizing worlds." "Yes, I noticed that," Rodriguez agreed. "Quite impressive. Very expensive looking. Is there something specific you need help with?" The casual dismissal of his fleet's power was so complete that Admiral Kestar found himself wondering if he was experiencing some kind of translation error. "You do understand that we have the capability to enforce Council authority through military action?" "Of course. We assumed that was why you brought so many ships." Captain Rodriguez's expression remained pleasant, though I have to ask, what exactly are you planning to enforce? Council membership? Compliance with galactic law. Submission to proper authority. Ah. Rodriguez nodded as if something had been clarified. "And what happens if we decline?" Admiral Kestar felt the conversation slipping away from him. This was supposed to be a demonstration of power, a show of force that would bring the humans to their senses. Instead, he was being drawn into what felt like a philosophical discussion. Then we would be forced to take action to protect galactic stability. What kind of action? The question hung in the air between the two ships like a challenge. Admiral Kestar realized that he was being forced to articulate something that was usually left unspoken in Council diplomacy. "Military action," he said finally. "Against our colonies, our worlds, our people, if necessary." Captain Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her tone had shifted subtly. The casual pleasantness was still there, but underneath it was something harder. "Admiral, let me make sure I understand your position. You're saying that if we continue to govern ourselves according to our own judgment, you'll attack our civilian populations to force us to comply with your authority? I'm saying that the Galactic Council has a responsibility to maintain order and stability throughout known space, by threatening to commit genocide against anyone who disagrees with your methods."
The word genocide struck the bridge like a physical blow.
Admiral Kestar felt his officers shifting uncomfortably around him. The ugly reality of what they were discussing had been laid bare in a way that no amount of diplomatic language could disguise. "It wouldn't come to that," he said quickly. "A limited demonstration of force would be sufficient to terrorize us into compliance."
Rodriguez finished.
"Admiral, what you're describing is extortion backed by the threat of mass murder. Are you comfortable with that characterization?" Admiral Kestar found himself struggling for words. The conversation had moved far from the usual patterns of military diplomacy into territory that made him deeply uncomfortable. "The Council system has maintained peace for 12,000 years, he said, falling back on established doctrine. "Your peace," Rodriguez replied gently, "built on the threat of violence against anyone who might threaten it. That's not peace, Admiral. That's a protection racket." The accusation struck home with devastating accuracy. Around the bridge, Admiral Kestar could see his officers exchanging glances, their expressions troubled. You don't understand the complexity of galactic governance, he tried again.
Maybe not, Rodriguez agreed. But I understand the difference between cooperation and coercion. What you're offering isn't membership in a community of equals.
It's submission to a hierarchy that maintains power through intimidation. And what's your alternative? Chaos? Every species for itself? Wars without end? For the first time, Captain Rodriguez smiled, and something in that expression made Admiral Kestar suddenly very nervous. Our alternative is to be left alone to succeed or fail on our own merits. To build relationships based on mutual respect rather than fear. To face the universe on our own terms. That's impossible. No single species can survive in isolation. We're not in isolation, Admiral. We're in independence. There's a difference. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving the bridge of the inevitable victory in uncomfortable silence. Admiral Kestar stared at the blank screen, trying to process what had just happened. Sir? Captain Morthick asked carefully. Your orders? Admiral Kestar turned to study the tactical display. The human ship was still approaching, still unarmed, still radiating the kind of calm confidence that suggested its crew was completely unworried about the presence of the Council fleet. Sir? His aide pressed. How do you want to respond? That was the question, wasn't it? How did you respond to someone who refused to be intimidated? How did you negotiate with someone who wouldn't acknowledge your authority? How did you threaten someone who seemed genuinely unafraid of your threats? The Admiral was still contemplating these questions when alarms began sounding across the bridge. Sir, the sensor operator called out. Multiple contacts approaching from inside human space. Admiral Kestar spun toward the tactical display and felt his heart skip several beats. Emerging from the deeper reaches of human territory came a formation that defied everything the Council thought it knew about human military capabilities. The ships were unlike anything in their databases. Where Council vessels favored size and overwhelming firepower, these human warships seemed built around speed and precision. They moved with a fluid grace that suggested advanced maneuvering systems, and their hulls seemed to absorb sensor scans in ways that made detailed analysis difficult. How many? Admiral Kestar asked, his voice tight. Still counting, sir. At least 300 confirmed contacts, possibly more. They're maintaining formation at the edge of sensor range. 300 ships? Captain Morthek's voice cracked slightly. Intelligence said they had maybe 50 military vessels. Intelligence was wrong, Admiral Kestar replied grimly. About a lot of things, apparently. The human fleet had arranged itself in a loose sphere that completely surrounded the Council formation. Not close enough to constitute an immediate threat, but positioned with obvious tactical precision. The message was clear without being explicitly threatening. You are surrounded, but we're not attacking. Yet. Admiral Kestar opened a channel to the approaching civilian ship. Captain Rodriguez, I think we need to continue our conversation. When Rodriguez appeared on screen again, her expression had not changed, but something in her posture suggested that she was no longer simply a messenger. Certainly, Admiral. What would you like to discuss? Those ships. Your intelligence reports suggested a much smaller military presence. Your intelligence reports were based on what we chose to let you see, Rodriguez replied matter-of-factly. We've been aware of your surveillance efforts for quite some time. The casual admission that they had been feeding false information to Council intelligence was delivered with the same pleasant tone she might use to comment on the weather. So this is a trap? Admiral Kestar asked. This is a conversation, Rodriguez corrected. The same conversation we've been trying to have with your government, just with a slightly more honest assessment of the relative capabilities involved. You're threatening a Council fleet. We're providing context for our earlier statements about independence. You brought a military force into our space to intimidate us. We're demonstrating that intimidation is unlikely to be effective. Admiral Kestar studied the tactical display again. His fleet was powerful, certainly capable of inflicting enormous damage. But surrounded as they were, with limited room to maneuver and facing an unknown number of vessels with unknown capabilities, the situation had become far more complex than a simple show of force. What do you want? He asked finally. The same thing we wanted when this started, Rodriguez replied. To be left alone to govern ourselves. The difference is that now you have a better understanding of what leaving us alone actually entails. You can't expect the Council to simply ignore your existence. We don't expect you to ignore us. We expect you to respect our independence. There's a difference. Admiral Kestar was quiet for a long moment. Around him, his officers waited for orders that he found himself reluctant to give. The tactical situation was far from hopeless. But it was no longer the overwhelming advantage it had been when they arrived. And if we choose not to respect that independence, Rodriguez's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. Then you'll discover why we weren't particularly worried about your fleet, Admiral. And trust me, that's not knowledge you want to acquire. The threat was delivered so calmly that it took a moment for its full implications to register. When it did, Admiral Kestar felt a chill run down his spine. You're saying you could destroy this fleet? I'm saying that if you force us to choose between submission and survival, we'll choose survival. And we're very, very good at surviving. The transmission ended again, leaving Admiral Kestar alone with his thoughts and the uncomfortable realization that everything the Council thought it knew about humanity was probably wrong. In the tactical display, the human ships maintained their positions, patient and watchful. No weapons were charged, no aggressive maneuvers were being made, but the implication was clear. This was not a species that could be bullied into compliance. The Admiral found himself facing a choice that 12,000 years of galactic civilization had never prepared him for. He could order an attack, gambling his fleet, and possibly his civilization, on the outcome. Or he could acknowledge that humanity represented something new in the galaxy, something that would have to be dealt with on entirely different terms. Either way, the age of automatic compliance was over. The only question was how much of the existing order would survive its ending. Emergency session bells rang throughout the Council station, as representatives from across the galaxy gathered to address the crisis that was rapidly spiraling beyond anyone's control. The chamber that had witnessed humanity's simple refusal now hosted the most contentious gathering in Council history. Chancellor Vorthak stood before the assembly, his hide cycling through colors that indicated extreme stress. The reports from Admiral Kestar's fleet had reached the Council 3 hours ago, and the implications were still reverberating through the corridors of power. The situation, the Chancellor began, his voice strained, has become more complicated than our initial assessments indicated. That was an understatement that would have been amusing under different circumstances. Scattered throughout the chamber, representatives from hundreds of species were displaying various forms of agitation, from the rapid chittering of the insectoid Thari to the deep subsonic rumbles of the massive Petra Prime delegates. "Complicated how?" demanded Councillor Zarathil, her crystalline structure ringing with harmonic frequencies that indicated deep concern. "We sent a fleet to demonstrate Council authority. Either they submitted or they didn't." "They demonstrated their own authority instead," Chancellor Vorthak replied grimly. "Fleet Admiral Kestar reports that human military capabilities exceed our estimates by a factor of at least 6 to 1. The chamber erupted in sound as representatives processed this information. The implications were staggering, not just for the immediate situation, but for everything they thought they understood about galactic power structures. 6 to 1? Councillor Ethmara's mandibles clicked rapidly. "How's that possible? They've been in space for less than 50 years. According to the Admiral's report," Chancellor Vorthak continued, "they've been deliberately concealing their true capabilities while conducting comprehensive surveillance of our own forces. We've been making decisions based on incomplete and deliberately misleading information." In the human delegation area, the 5 representatives sat with the same calm composure they had maintained throughout the crisis. Ambassador Vasquez watched the proceedings with polite interest, occasionally making notes on a simple tablet. Director Yulmoth of the Intelligence Division stood to address the assembly. "I've had my analysts review all available data in light of these new revelations. The picture that emerges is deeply disturbing. The director activated a holographic display that showed human space as they now understood it. Where before they had seen a small cluster of colonies, the display now revealed a sophisticated network of settlements, industrial centers, and defensive installations. They haven't just been expanding randomly," Director Yulmoth explained. "They've been implementing a coordinated strategy designed to achieve complete self-sufficiency within their sphere of influence. They don't need our trade routes because they've built their own. They don't need our technology because they've developed alternatives. They don't need our protection because they've become capable of protecting themselves." "And we didn't notice any of this?" asked Councillor Murthak of the Economic Planning Committee. "We noticed what they wanted us to notice," the director replied. "Our intelligence operations were focused on standard emergence patterns. We were looking for the usual signs of a developing civilization seeking integration with galactic society. We never considered that they might be deliberately avoiding such integration." The implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud. If humanity had been able to conceal this much from Council intelligence, what else might they be hiding? And more importantly, what did their true capabilities mean for the balance of power in the galaxy? "The immediate question," Chancellor Vorthak said, trying to regain control of the discussion, is how we respond to this situation. Admiral Kestar is requesting instructions. What are his tactical options? Asked General Vorthek of the Military Oversight Committee. The Chancellor's aide Trex Land consulted his notes with obvious nervousness. According to the Admiral's assessment, an attack would likely result in the destruction of the Council fleet with minimal damage to human forces. The chamber fell silent. In 12,000 years of Council authority, no one could remember a situation where a Council fleet had been placed at such a tactical disadvantage. He could withdraw, suggested Councillor Zarathel. Regroup, bring additional forces. To what end? Director Yulmoth asked. If their current estimate of human capabilities is even remotely accurate, we would need to commit the majority of our available military assets. And for what? To force a species into membership they don't want? To maintain Council authority? Chancellor Vorthak replied automatically. To preserve the order that has kept peace in the galaxy for millennia. Whose peace? The question came from an unexpected source. Councillor Telmiran of the Outer Rim Confederacy, a minor member species that rarely spoke during major debates. All attention turned to the Outer Rim representative, a thin humanoid whose species had joined the Council over 2 centuries ago. I asked whose peace we're preserving, Councillor Telmiran repeated, because I'm beginning to wonder if the humans aren't asking the right questions. Councillor. Chancellor Vorthak said warningly, this is not the time for philosophical discussions, isn't it? Telmiran replied, standing to address the assembly. For the first time in anyone's memory, we're faced with a species that doesn't want what we're offering. Maybe that should make us ask whether what we're offering is actually as beneficial as we assume. Murmurs of agreement rippled through sections of the chamber, particularly from the smaller member species. Chancellor Vorthak's hide darkened ominously. The Council system has brought order to chaos, ended countless wars, eliminated poverty and want throughout civilized space, he declared. These are not assumptions, they are facts. Facts that apply to those who were permitted to join, Telmiran replied. But what about those who weren't? What about the species that were deemed too primitive, too aggressive, too independent? What happened to them? The question struck the assembly like a physical blow. It was a topic that was rarely discussed in council chambers, the uncomfortable reality that not all species had been offered membership in the galactic community. That's different, Chancellor Vorthak protested. Those species were evaluated according to established criteria that included willingness to submit to council authority, Ambassador Vasquez said quietly, speaking for the first time since the session had begun. The human's words carried clearly through the chamber's acoustics. Every representative turned to look at her as she stood slowly, her movement drawing attention like a magnet. We've been listening to your debate with great interest, she continued, and we think Councillor Telemiran has identified the core issue. Which is? Chancellor Vorthak demanded. You've built a system that requires universal participation to function, but you've never asked whether universal participation is actually desirable or just convenient for maintaining control. Ambassador Vasquez stepped into the center of the chamber, her presence somehow commanding, despite the fact that she was vastly outnumbered. You speak of maintaining peace, but what you've actually created is a monopoly on violence. You've eliminated war between council members by ensuring that no one has the capability to wage war against council authority. That's not peace, Chancellor. That's subjugation. We have created order from chaos, the Chancellor replied, his voice rising. We have built a civilization that spans the galaxy. You've built a civilization that serves your interests, Vasquez countered. And now you're faced with a species that has different interests, different values, different goals. The question is whether you can tolerate that diversity or whether you'll destroy it to preserve your monopoly. General Chen stood to join the ambassador in the center of the chamber. The choice you're facing now is the same choice you've been making for 12,000 years. The only difference is that this time, your target has the ability to fight back. The general's words carried a weight that made several representatives shift uncomfortably in their seats. You can order Admiral Kestar to attack our fleet, Chen continued. You might even win, though I doubt it. But even if you do, what then? You attack our colonies? Our worlds? How many civilians are you willing to kill to maintain your authority over people who never asked for it? How far are you willing to go? Dr. Kim added, stepping forward to join her colleagues. To force people to accept benefits they don't want? The 3 humans stood in the center of the vast chamber, surrounded by representatives from hundreds of species. Yet somehow they seemed to dominate the space through sheer presence. This is not about benefits, Chancellor Vorthak declared. This is about stability, about order, about preventing the galaxy from descending into chaos. Who's chaos? Admiral Morrison asked, joining the group. We're not attacking anyone. We're not threatening anyone. We're simply existing according to our own principles. If that threatens your stability, maybe your stability is more fragile than you want to admit. Director Petrov completed the human circle, his quiet voice carrying clearly through the chamber. The real question isn't whether we'll submit to your authority. The real question is whether your authority can survive our refusal. The 5 humans stood together in silence, letting their words sink in. Around them, the assembled representatives were beginning to grapple with concepts that challenged the fundamental assumptions of their civilization. You're threatening the Council, Chancellor Vorthax said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. We're not threatening anything, Ambassador Vasquez replied. We're simply existing. If our existence threatens your system, that suggests the problem lies with your system, not with us. What do you want? Councillor Zarathil asked, her crystalline structure ringing with what sounded like desperation. Nothing from you, Vasquez answered. We want you to leave us alone to build our own civilization, make our own mistakes, and face our own consequences. We want independence. Independence leads to conflict, the Chancellor insisted. It always has. Your system leads to conflict too, General Chen replied. It just ensures that the conflict is one-sided. The chamber fell silent as the implications of the exchange became clear. This wasn't a negotiation in any traditional sense. The humans weren't asking for better terms or seeking compromise. They were challenging the very foundation of galactic civilization. And for the first time in 12,000 years, that foundation was showing cracks. In the tactical display that floated above the chamber, the positions of Admiral Kestar's fleet and the surrounding human vessels remained unchanged, but the meaning of those positions had shifted dramatically. What had begun as a show of force had become a test of principles, and the outcome would determine whether the galaxy was large enough for 2 different visions of civilization. The waiting continued, but now everyone understood that when it ended, nothing would ever be quite the same again. 6 months after the standoff that had brought the galaxy to the brink of war, Chancellor Vorthax stood in his private office overlooking the Council Station's central hub. The view was the same as always, ships coming and going in the endless dance of galactic commerce and diplomacy. But everything else had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The decision to recall Admiral Kestar's fleet had not come easily. The debate in the Council chamber had continued for another 18 hours, growing increasingly heated as representatives grappled with concepts that challenged everything they thought they understood about galactic civilization. In the end, it was not humanitarian concerns or philosophical arguments that had swayed the vote, but simple pragmatism. The cost of forcing human compliance would have been catastrophic. Even if the Council had been willing to commit the resources necessary for military victory, the precedent would have been devastating. For the first time in 12 millennia, member species were asking uncomfortable questions about the nature of Council authority, and those questions would not be easily answered. The Chancellor's aide, Trexlan, entered the office carrying the latest batch of reports that had become the bane of Vorthax's existence. Sir, the latest intelligence assessments.
How many today?
14 species have submitted formal inquiries regarding the voluntary nature of Council membership. 22 have requested clarification on self-governance provisions. And the Outer Rim Confederacy has officially filed a proposal for what they're calling graduated autonomy. Chancellor Vorthax's hide shifted to a tired grey. The questions had started within hours of the human fleet demonstration and had been growing steadily ever since. Species that had never questioned Council authority were suddenly asking why that authority was necessary, what benefits it actually provided, and whether there might be alternatives. And the humans? No change in status. They continue to expand at the same rate, maintain their self-imposed isolation from Council space, and show no signs of reconsidering their position. The Chancellor turned back to the viewport. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of Council sensors, human civilization was growing according to its own vision of what the future should look like. The intelligence report suggested a thriving society that had solved problems the Council was still struggling with, developed technologies the Council had never considered, and created social structures that seemed to function without the elaborate regulatory framework that kept galactic civilization stable. Sir, Trexlan ventured, the Outer Rim proposal? Schedule it for committee review, the Chancellor replied wearily, along with all the others. That was the reality of the new galaxy. The Council was spending more time reviewing its own authority than exercising it, and every review raised new questions that had no easy answers. Meanwhile, in a conference room aboard the human vessel Defiance, Captain Sarah Torres was hosting a very different kind of meeting. Representatives from 6 non-council species sat around a simple table, sharing tea and conversation in the kind of informal atmosphere that would have horrified council diplomatic protocol. "The question," said Ambassador Kethmar of the Independent Helix Alliance, "is whether what you've achieved can be replicated on a smaller scale." Captain Torres smiled. "Ambassador, the beauty of independence is that it doesn't require replication. It requires adaptation. What works for us might not work for you. But that's the point. You get to figure out what does work. But how do we know we're ready?" asked Minister Daltarine of the Spiral Consortium. "Your species achieved remarkable technological advancement before claiming independence. We're still developing our capabilities. So were we when we made our choice, Dr. Elena Santos replied. Dr. Santos had been dispatched from Earth specifically to assist with what humans had begun calling independence consultation. The difference is that we chose to develop those capabilities ourselves rather than accepting them from someone else's vision of what we needed. The meeting was one of dozens taking place throughout the galaxy, as word of humanity's successful resistance spread. Non-council species that had been operating on the margins of galactic civilization were discovering that they had options beyond eventual submission to council authority. "The risks are significant," warned Commander Zexthal of the Free Navigation Guild. "The Council has made it clear that they view independence movements as threats to galactic stability." "They would," Captain Torres agreed. "But their ability to act on those views has been significantly complicated by our example. They can't use the same tactics against you that they were prepared to use against us. Because you demonstrated that those tactics might not work, because we demonstrated that resistance is possible," Dr. McCallumere, Santos corrected. "The Council's power has always depended on the assumption that resistance is futile. Once that assumption proves false, everything changes." The conversation continued for another 2 hours, covering topics from defensive strategies to economic independence to the philosophical foundations of self-governance. When it ended, the non-council representatives departed with more questions than answers, but also with something they had never had before: hope that alternatives existed. Back on the council station, Director Yilmoth was briefing a closed session of senior leadership on what his intelligence networks had discovered about the growing independence movement. "The humans aren't actively recruiting," he reported, "but they're not discouraging contact either. They've established what they call consultation protocols for species interested in exploring self-governance options."
Consultation protocols? Chancellor Vorthak's hide darkened.
"They're teaching rebellion. They're teaching alternatives," corrected Councillor Zarathil, who had become increasingly vocal in questioning council responses to the crisis. "There's a difference." "The difference being?" the Chancellor asked icily. "Rebellion seeks to overthrow existing authority. The humans are simply demonstrating that existing authority isn't universal or inevitable." The distinction was more than semantic, and everyone in the room knew it. The humans weren't trying to destroy the council or conquer other species. They were simply existing as proof that other ways of organizing civilization were possible. "The practical result is the same," General Vorthak growled. "Council authority is being undermined." "Council authority was always dependent on consent," Councillor Zarathil replied. "We just never admitted it because that consent was never really tested." The debate that followed was becoming depressingly familiar to Chancellor Vorthak. Where once the Council had spoken with unified purpose, now every decision was questioned, every policy was debated, and every action was analyzed for its impact on what the analysts were calling systemic legitimacy. The most frustrating part was that the humans continued to ignore Council space entirely. They made no aggressive moves, issued no ultimatums, and maintained no hostile positions. They simply continued to exist and expand according to their own principles. And somehow that passive resistance was more destabilizing than any military threat. In the depths of space, Admiral Kestar commanded a much-reduced fleet tasked with monitoring the expanding web of independence movements. The assignment was both crucial and thankless, requiring him to observe developments that he was powerless to influence. "Sir," his intelligence officer reported, "we're detecting another coordination meeting in the neutral zone. Representatives from 12 non-council species, all gathering at the same station." Admiral Kestar studied the sensor readings with professional interest. The station in question was owned and operated by humans, though it existed technically outside both council and human space. It had become a kind of informal embassy for species exploring independence options. "Any council response planned?" "No, sir. The diplomatic corps has classified such meetings as internal affairs of sovereign entities. The Admiral allowed himself a bitter smile. 6 months ago, the phrase sovereign entities would never have been applied to non-council species. The humans had introduced a vocabulary that was reshaping how the galaxy thought about authority and independence. Maintain observation, he ordered. But no interference. The order would have been unthinkable before the human crisis. Council fleets had always operated under the assumption that galactic stability required active intervention to prevent the emergence of alternative power structures. Now they were reduced to watching such structures develop while debating whether intervention was legally or morally justified. On the human world of New Geneva, in a meeting room that overlooked the planet's capital city, the 5 original human representatives were reviewing reports from across their expanding sphere of influence. The Helix Alliance formally withdrew their council membership application yesterday, Admiral Morrison reported. That makes 14 species that have chosen independence over integration in the past month.
And the Council's response? Asked Ambassador Vasquez.
Officially, they respect the sovereign right of species to make their own choices regarding galactic participation, Director Petrov replied with obvious amusement. Unofficially, Chancellor Vorthak is reportedly considering resignation. The reports painted a picture of a galaxy in transition. The rigid hierarchy that had maintained order for 12 millennia was giving way to a more complex system, where independence was a viable option, where alternatives to council authority were being explored, and where the assumption of universal submission was no longer valid. The question, General Chen said thoughtfully, is whether this represents evolution or collapse. For the council system as it existed, collapse, definitely, Dr. Kim replied. For galactic civilization as a whole, evolution. The galaxy is big enough for multiple approaches to organization and governance. Ambassador Vasquez stood and walked to the window, looking out over a city that had been built entirely according to human vision and values. The real test will come when some of these new independent civilizations encounter serious challenges. Will they be able to solve their own problems, or will they turn back to the Council for solutions? And if they do turn back, Admiral Morrison asked, then the Council will have to decide whether they're willing to help without demanding submission, Vasquez replied, whether they can evolve from an authority structure into a service organization. The conversation was interrupted by an incoming transmission from Captain Torres aboard the Defiance. When her image appeared on the main screen, her expression was serious. Ambassador, we've received a formal communication from the Galactic Council. Chancellor Vorthak is requesting a meeting. What kind of meeting? Vasquez asked. He's proposing what he calls a new framework for galactic coexistence. Apparently, the Council has accepted that the previous system is no longer sustainable. The 5 representatives exchanged glances. After 6 months of passive resistance and growing independence movements, the Council was finally ready to acknowledge that the galaxy had changed. When and where? Admiral Morrison asked. Neutral space, equal representation, no preconditions, Torres replied. He's essentially proposing to negotiate a treaty between equals. Ambassador Vasquez turned back to the window, watching the lights of the human city sparkle in the gathering dusk. Somewhere out there, across the vast expanse of space, other worlds were making their own choices about their future. The age of automatic compliance was over, and the age of negotiated coexistence was beginning. Accept the meeting, she said finally. But make it clear that we're not negotiating humanity's independence. We're discussing how independent civilizations can coexist in the same galaxy. As the transmission ended, the 5 humans sat in comfortable silence, contemplating the implications of their success. They had set out to secure humanity's right to self-determination, but they had inadvertently sparked a galactic revolution. The universe would never be the same, and somehow that felt exactly right. Outside the window, the stars continued their ancient dance, indifferent to the small dramas of civilizations that rose and fell beneath their light. But among those stars, something new was being born. A galaxy where choice was possible, where alternatives existed, and where the simple word no had changed everything. The human experiment in independence had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. Now came the harder task of helping that independence evolve into something that could sustain itself across the vast reaches of space and time. But as they had proven once already, humans were very good at facing impossible challenges. The new galaxy was just beginning.